Okay, everybody, hello and welcome to Lecture 7 in the Politics of Religion. In the last two lectures, we've been looking at some of the main themes around the rise and fall of religion, and the purpose of this lecture is to examine the rise and the politics of non-religion, looking particularly at the phenomena of new atheism, which we have encountered on a few occasions so far during the course of the module. For example, when we were talking about debates around science and religion, these are the sorts of characters who will take the side very strongly of the conflict thesis. And then, of course, last week, when we were talking about the cognitive science of religion and ideas about memes and so forth, these are the people who would talk about religion in respect of a mind virus. So we have kind of come across these people a bit. I'm going to get into them in more detail today and talk about the internal politics of new atheism and how it all works. And I've got quite a bit to get through, so I'm just going to jump straight into the plan. And this is what it looks like. I'm going to begin by talking about the concept of no religion, which we have talked about a little bit in seminars, but I'm going to go into a slightly more detail now. Then I'm going to talk about the origins and development of atheism, and then finally talk about the internal politics of new atheism. So we begin then with the general category of no religion, and this is a significant category for a number of reasons. As we've already seen, no religion is classified. It's a bit difficult, obviously, to get up-to-date, reliable, accurate information on all of this stuff. So some of these figures are guesstimates, and these, the data you're looking at here, this is from obviously the Pew report of 2025. The data is up to 2020. And yeah, as we know, no religion is estimated to be the third largest religious category in the world, just behind Christianity and Islam. And as we saw in the last lecture when we were talking about secularization, the proportion of adults who describe themselves as being non-religious has grown substantially in Western countries, at least during the past few decades. The academic study of non-religion, however, is relatively new. This is one of the main journals in the area. I think this is probably the only journal dedicated specifically to looking at the study of non-religion, and it only started in 2012. So the academic study of non-religion as a scholarly category is still in its relative infancy, and the concept of non-religion can be very tricky to pin down. One reason for this is, I think we might have talked about this in seminars, so forgive me if I'm slightly repeating myself a little bit, but when you ask people in surveys about their religious views, people get a list of boxes to tick, right? So you can describe yourself as Christian or Muslim or Jewish or Hindu or Buddhist or, whatever. But when people who want to identify as non-religion, they typically only get one box which says no religion. You don't have a list of categories which says, agnostic, atheist, humanist, whatever, right? But this is part of the problem, because the category of no religion contains within it a whole range of identity markers that are not necessarily captured in the survey data that we have. And this is sort of slightly problematic for reasons that I'll come on to in a few minutes. Another reason why it's difficult to pin down the concept of non-religion is that it's also very often defined in negative terms. So it's defined as the absence of something. Right? A person who does not believe in religion, and that's basically it. So there is an alternative way of looking at no religion, which is that a lot of people who describe themselves being non-religious will say it's a positive identity. They will affirm their identity as a humanist, let's say, and that will be the presence of something, an active belief or an active worldview and an active way of life or something like this, rather than the mere absence of something, a negation. So trying to pin down exactly what non-religion is can be a bit tricky, and it also, this is the problem with measuring this stuff, it also includes, so the general category, certainly in the United States at least, is called the nuns, right? These are the religiously unaffiliated. And that category contains a whole range of people. It's basically people who are not officially linked to religion. But those people could still be religious. They just don't happen to be a member of a religious group. And as you can see, the beliefs of the nuns, the beliefs of the religiously unaffiliated, can vary quite widely. So just, direct your attention here towards the top line. As you can see, the light blue category will say 53% of people in the United States who describe themselves as being religiously unaffiliated, i.e. having no religion, 53% of them still believe in some kind of higher power or spiritual force. We were talking about this last week, right, in secularization, the idea that people would moving away from institutionalized religion, but now increasingly describing themselves as being spiritual, but not religious. And that's evidence for it, right? More than half of people who describe themselves as having no religion would still profess to have a belief in some kind of higher power. And then if you look at the figure to the left of that, 17% of people of no religion in the United States profess to have belief in God as described in the Bible. So this category, and this is basically, the only real category we have, if you're looking for data on this stuff. So the data is quite problematic, and we have to be aware of all these differences when we're thinking about no religion and how it works, because it does contain lots of different groups of people, and they don't necessarily pull in all the same direction. So that's one thing. Okay, the historical story of no religion really begins in ancient Greece. And the main label at this time was atheism. So the idea of humanism, which sort of now is I would say, maybe the second most popular, or maybe the third. You certainly got humanism, atheism, agnosticism are kind of the big three, I would say. Actually, I'm talking myself out of this now. Maybe spiritual but not religious would be... This is the problem. We don't even know how many of these people there are. But anyway, humanism as an identity, as a term, didn't really start to emerge until the 14th century as a philosophical idea. But the term humanism itself wasn't invented until the 19th century. So you can look back and you can find historical philosophical ideas that people would map onto what we now consider to be humanism, but the term humanism itself doesn't exist for a few hundred years after this. And so, the term agnosticism, by the way, also wasn't invented until the 19th century. A guy called T.H. Huxley. So initially, the main label to describe non-religion was atheism. And the term atheism comes from the Greek word atheos, which means without gods. It's literally, as you can see here, atheism. And the denial of the claim that theism is making. So atheism is literally not that, right? We take whatever theism is and we say, we don't agree with that. And that's basically what atheism is, on a very technical level, atheism. And the idea was fueled by Greek philosophers who claimed that the universe worked according to regular laws, and that these regular laws could be uncovered and understood using the power of reason. And one of the key thinkers at the time, there were a few, and I'm not going to go through all of them because there's quite a few, but one of the key thinkers at this time was Xenophanes. He's credited as being the first person to put down, at least in writing, this idea that religion represents some kind of anthropomorphism, right? I don't know how good your memory is, but if you can kind of think back to one of the earlier classes, we were talking about Ludwig von Feuerbach, and he had this idea that religion was all about anthropology, and it was a kind of a reflection of people's internal values and desires and so forth. Well, this guy was the first to make that point, Xenophanes. And you can see here in the a quote, what he's basically saying is, if horses and cows had gods and they could draw, they would draw gods that looked like horses and cows, right? It's kind of reflecting the fact that the human gods are a reflection of human concerns and human desires and human physical characteristics and so on. The most famous doubter of all, though, was Socrates, who was famously put to death for questioning the existence of the gods. An act that was said to be corrupting the youth of Athens. He was encouraging them also to question things. And, those of you who take the view that religion is a form of social control, this is right up your alley, right? It's posing a threat to the social order, therefore we can't have any of this thing, so, Socrates has to go. Now, one of the interesting things about atheism in the ancient world is that it's very different to atheism now. It's very different to modern forms of atheism. Now, it's difficult to know exactly what ancient atheists thought about things because our records are quite patchy, right? All really have to go on are a few fragments of things, a few texts sort of here and there, and then there's a process of trying to reverse engineer a few bits. So we don't know fully what the ancients thought about this stuff in the at this particular time. But as far as we can tell, atheism at this point was more about raising critical questions, like Socrates, about the nature and the existence of gods, rather than making active claims of disbelief. So this latter view, the view which says, I actively do not believe in God, that's a very modern form of atheism. It's sometimes called philosophical atheism, or maybe more commonly, speculative atheism. But the atheism of the ancient world was more about questioning, how do the gods work? Right? Why do the gods behave in this particular way? Why are they doing this? Right? Rather than saying, no, I don't believe in any of this stuff. Right? That sort of view comes later on. And one of the reasons for this is that the religious systems of the ancient world were polytheistic, and they were largely performative rather than propositional. So religion in the ancient world was more based around rituals and practices rather than rigidly defined sets of correct belief. So in the ancient world, you could pretty much believe whatever you wanted within reason. I mean, atheism was sort of criminalized, so that was a sort of step too far. But nobody really cared too much, as long as you took part in the main kind of public rituals, right? They would have these, certainly in the Roman Empire, you'd have these big public rituals which were religious in character, and the purpose of these rituals was to protect the security of the state. And people thought that if they didn't carry out these rituals, then, all hell would break loose and the barbarians would come over the border and, society would collapse and everything else, right? So you kind of had to turn up for those kinds of things and show your face. But apart from that, nobody was really bothered, right? There wasn't a set of beliefs that everybody had to sign up to. There was no, what you would say, religious orthodoxy. And so, because theism didn't have any correct beliefs to follow, the atheism that emerged during this time was not based upon the rejection of or the challenging a particular orthodoxy, because there wasn't one. Now all this then, of course, starts to change when we get into the Middle Ages. And the big shift here, of course, is the rise of a monotheistic religion, in this case Christianity, that did have a set of correct beliefs to follow, and a set of beliefs that, people were persecuted and hounded if they didn't follow them. And so, as the character of theism changed, so the character of atheism also began to change. And so, because monotheism asserts that only one God exists, atheism moved from questioning the nature of gods generally towards denying the existence of the one particular God that theism says exists. Now, it's still difficult to know exactly what people thought during this time, because the Christian church, of course, had enormous political power, and being an atheist was extremely dangerous, so people tended to present their thoughts about atheism anonymously. A classic example of this, which comes from the 16th, 17th centuries, is a document called The Three Impostors, and this was an anonymous pamphlet that was circulating around the intelligentsia circles in Europe at this time, denying the existence of the gods of Judaism, or denying the claims of Judaism, Christianity and Islam. But this, nobody knows who wrote this, because understandably the person didn't want to put their name to it, because they're going to get caught and they're going to be in a spot of bother. So you do have these ideas sort of circulating, but it's very difficult to attribute them to some people. There was a rumour going around at one point that Thomas Hobbes might have been an atheist as well. I think it had something to do with the fire of London, or the plague, or some kind of terrible thing which befell the nation. And then MPs in the House of Parliament were saying, well, it's all due to Thomas Hobbes, a bloody atheist. He probably wasn't an atheist. That was probably kind of stretching the point a bit. But anyway, yes, it was very difficult to know exactly what people thought because they wanted to keep it hidden. The first publicly attributable statement of atheism that we have on the record came from a guy called Jean Meslier, which was quite surprising, not least because Jean Meslier was a Catholic priest, and they only found out he was secretly an atheist after he died. I mean, imagine their surprise, dear diary, and then he kind of says, as a priest, I had no choice but to do this, but I really didn't like my job, I think is the point of this particular statement here. So this is the first statement of actual atheism that we have on the record. Other key atheists of the time include Denis Diderot, who's the gentleman in the top left, who was the co-creator of the Encyclopedia, who lived in the 18th century, although he did waver between atheism and deism, so he sort of couldn't really make his mind up. On the right, we've got Baron d'Holbach, who was the most famous atheist in Europe at the time, also in the 18th century, but again wrote a lot of his stuff anonymously. He didn't want to put his name to his thoughts in case, people, in case he got in trouble as well. And then at the bottom we've got Percy Shelley, the famous English poet, who was expelled from Oxford University in 1811 for writing an anonymous pamphlet called The Necessity of Atheism. Obviously, they tracked him down, probably put his student number into Tabula or something and found out who he was, and then they threw him out. And this is the first set of atheist ideas ever to be printed in English. So these are some of the main ones. There are others as well. I'm just kind of giving you a flavour of this. Bear in mind, this is also, not much diversity going on here, right? These are basically sort of white, middle class / upper class men, which is quite significant for something that I'm going to come on to later. So we're starting to get towards a different character of atheism, right? By this point, it's actively denying the existence of God. And in addition to its philosophical position, modern atheism was also notable for its overt political character, which was way more active than the atheism in the ancient world. The ancient world atheism wasn't like groups of people who all knew each other, like they all hung out together and talked about atheism and they all campaigned for atheism. It wasn't anything like that. It was fragmented individuals, didn't even know each other, working independently and anonymously, and there's no sense of any kind of political, movement to this stuff until you get to modern atheism. And one of the reasons for this, again, is because the Christian church was quite active in suppressing ideas that it didn't agree with. A lot of the times those would be ideas from within the Christian church, but particularly didn't like any idea that that non-religion might be sort of gaining, or trying to gain a foothold. So non-religious views were suppressed, and so there's a sort of sense in which atheism at this point is a reaction to this. And it takes on this political character almost as sort of, a resistance to oppression. We can see this really strongly in the French Revolution, for example, one of the aims of which, of course, was to bring down the regime of the Catholic Church, which succeeded until Napoleon took over and then brought it back in 1815. And we also see this in the sort of growth of independent political, non-religious movements. The National Secular Society in the UK, for example, which was established in 1866. A similar dynamic we also find is in the communist revolution of the 20th century, which saw religion, we've already kind of talked a little bit about this with the ideas of Karl Marx, which saw religion as being a tool of capitalist oppression, and then promoted atheism as being the official ideology of the state, which then famously didn't oppress anybody ever again. Now, this is sort of where we're getting in terms of modern atheism, but in terms of contemporary atheism, this is a very, very quick and potted history, I'm sure you'll appreciate. We then need to turn to the new atheism. And there's no consensus on what the new atheism is, but I'm going to break it down in terms of 8 characteristics. There's no particular reason why it has to be 8 characteristics. This is just how it appeared to me when I sort of wrote them down. You could probably do it in 5 or 10 or, whatever, right? It doesn't really matter. But these are, to my mind, the main features of new atheism. And first of all, most accounts about the new atheism focus on a very small number, again, white men, high-profile authors. So going from left to right, we've got Richard Dawkins, I'm sure you will recognise. Then we have Sam Harris. Then it's Christopher Hitchens, and then on the right we've got Daniel Dennett, all of whom wrote very, very best-selling books about the topic of religion within the same kind of period of time. They were all kind of making the same points, making the same ideas, and they became collectively known as the Four Horsemen, because, you know, the Four Horsemen of the apocalypse and all of that. Okay, that's point number one. There are a whole bunch of other new atheists beyond these, by the way. It's not just the Four Horsemen, but in anything that gets written, or, you know, if you read anything about this stuff in the media, it's basically these guys. So that's point number one. Point number two is it's predominantly an Anglo-American phenomenon. It's most active, or at least it was most active, in the United States, for reasons that I will explain in a few minutes. Thirdly, it has a very strongly naturalistic worldview, which includes all that stuff we were talking about a few weeks ago about naturalistic views on morality. The new atheists sign up to all of that. Right? There are naturalistic, scientific explanations for pretty much everything, and those things in the universe that don't have scientific explanations for, it's just pending, right? Science is going to get there in the end. So science, rationalism, and reason are the only ways to understand reality. It also has, which is a point we've mentioned before, a propositional view of religion. In other words, new atheism treats religion as a set of truth claims about reality that can be treated as a scientific hypothesis. And if you can generate a scientific hypothesis, you can test a scientific hypothesis. And so, point number 5 is that the new atheists will say, well, religion is a hypothesis of how the universe works, and when you look at the evidence, it doesn't stack up whatsoever, so therefore religion is false, and these claims ought to be rejected. And because these claims ought to be rejected on the basis of having no evidence from a scientific worldview, the next step in the sort of chain of argument then is that only people can believe in religion through the ideas of faith, and if there's no evidence for it, it's just, you know, you have to be, religion is, you know, irrational, stupid, backwards, ridiculous. How could anybody possibly believe this stuff when all of the evidence points in the opposite direction? And because of that, religion is said to be uniquely dangerous, because it makes people believe things that are patently untrue. And because it does all this, it promotes these ideas of in-group dynamics, which lead to prejudice, intolerance, and obviously spill over into wider problems. Because of this, new atheists then also claim that religion should not have any privileged role in society whatsoever, but should be treated exactly the same as any other opinion. So the argument here is that, you know, we can speak freely about matters of politics or art or literature, you know, football, although as a Liverpool fan, does not talk about that too much. But yeah, it's not great, is it? Yes, but why then should religion be put in this kind of bracket of things that you cannot talk about, right? So religion should be freely criticised and freely discussed as just another aspect of social and cultural life. And then finally, this critical view applies to all religious beliefs, as well as attacking the more extreme varieties of religion, like creationist Christianity or radical Islam. New atheists also attack moderate forms of religion. And the argument here is that moderate religion, you know, like a little old lady who goes to church every Sunday, you know, reads the Bible now and again, says her prayers before she goes to sleep at night, not particularly known for being dangerous, right? But the argument here is that moderate religion helps to provide the plausibility structure and gives cover for the more extremist views of religion. And if you didn't have moderate religion, the extremists would be exposed for what they really are, which is just, you know, completely out there on their own. So you have to attack moderate religion to take away the sort of ideological cover. So the argument goes. So new atheism then, this is basically the features of new atheism, and it begins to take off midway through the first decade of this century. So we're talking around about 2005, 2006 time is when it starts to become noticed. And there are various reasons why New Atheism emerged at this particular point. And yeah, so here are four of the main ones, right? The first is, we were talking about this last week, which is secularization. And the argument here is that as religion declines in a society, it opens up the cultural space for non-religious ideas to gain more legitimacy, or at least it becomes more acceptable for people to have non-religious views. Right, so as religion shrinks, this creates the space for atheism. Secondly, although somewhat paradoxically given point number one, it was also driven by the return of religion. And this is essentially what happened is, from the end of the 1970s, religion starts to make a more prominent reappearance in public life. We have the Iranian Revolution, 1979. We have the growth of the Christian right aligned to the Republican Party in the United States. There's a few other things happening globally, but these are sort of two of the main ones. And there's this sense then that religion is starting to push back into public life and to become more assertive. And so the New Atheism was in part a reaction also to that. The third causal factor was essentially 9/11, right? Sam Harris started writing his book on New Atheism the day after the Twin Towers came down. And this was seen to be proof, if ever any was needed from the New Atheist perspective, that religion is dangerous. And religious violence was now a significant problem that needed to be dealt with. And so there needed to be a concerted pushback against religion. And then finally, we have the rise of the internet. Now, this is really central to New Atheism. I don't think New Atheism would have happened, actually, without the rise of the internet, because the internet makes it easier for ideas to spread, and it makes it easier for people to become organised and to start to communicate with each other and to pass these ideas around and to get a sense of a wider thing called New Atheism, rather than being just individuals dotted around the country with no particular connection to each other. So all of this then raises an obvious question, which is, what, if anything, is actually new about New Atheism? And this is an interesting point, because initially both New Atheists and critics said that New Atheism didn't actually exist. The views of the critics, who are just two of them, Alistair McGrath, who is an Oxford theologian, essentially described New Atheism as nothing but, exulting in ridiculing religion and religious believers. It's basically just aggressive, hostile, mocking people, making fun of people, calling them stupid and denigrating people. There's nothing particularly new about that. David Bentley Hart, as you can see, said the New Atheists had yet to produce anything other than an appallingly ignorant diatribe against religion. Absolutely no new ideas, nothing novel, nothing of any note. You can go back through the history of atheism and find people saying exactly the same stuff. This is just old atheism, but ruder, basically, is the idea here. And similar-ish views were also present within people who would be described as New Atheists, right? A.C. Grayling, you can see here, said, okay, fine, but then how can we be new if our arguments are old? Why are you calling us New Atheists? We're not New Atheists. I agree with you. We're just the same old atheists as we always were. So the question then is, well, how do we get this? Where does this New Atheist come from? If both critics and people who are in the New Atheist group are saying there's no such thing about New Atheism. Well, the reason for this is that the idea of New Atheism was a political construction. The label New Atheism was politically constructed. It was first used by a journalist called Gary Wolfe in 2006 in an article for Wired magazine called The Church of the Unbelievers. And what he's describing in this article is a small group of aggressive atheists clustered around the kind of cult hero of Richard Dawkins. And he was kind of writing an expose piece about how this group of people worked, right? And he called them the New Atheists. Of course, then what happened is that critics of atheism, critics of the New Atheism, then started calling it New Atheism precisely because that would be a way of delegitimizing them. Because then they could say, here are the New Atheists, but there's nothing really new about them, it's just the same old atheism, right? So it was a sort of a loop, an intellectual loop that they constructed by which they could then criticise atheism. We'll call them new, and then we'll attack them for not being actually really that new. And this was quite interesting because at the time, I was kind of following all this at the time. I was one of the first people, maybe even the first. Maybe that sounds a bit too Trumpian, so I don't want to go there. But I was one of the first to study the politics of all of this. And I remember following it at the time. This is the days when the internet had bulletin boards and forums and stuff, right, rather than apps. And people in these bulletin boards who were talking about these ideas of new atheism were going through all of these debates, like, what do we call ourselves? We need to get a label, right? There was a debate about labels. And let me see if I don't want to get ahead of myself in my notes. Where's the next one? I don't want to say the label thing now and then mess it up and then come back to it in a couple of minutes. No, I'll just do it now. If I screw my notes up, I'll screw my notes up. But there was essentially a debate about labelling. And this is one of the weird things about the New Atheists, is that for a group that has being really clever as like their defining feature, like the atheists are really clever and, you know, we've got everything figured out with science, I think, and religious people are really stupid and backwards, you know, and how the hell can they believe in all this stuff? They come out with some really weird ideas. So one idea for labelling at this point was from Dan Dennett, and he came out with a view that said new atheists should call themselves brights because they're really bright, right? And on the other hand, you had the supernatural crowd, the religious people, and they should be called the supers. So the idea was you'd have brights and super. That is like one of the worst ideas I've ever heard. You don't need to be even remotely close to being genius level to figure out why that's terrible. Other people were saying, Sam Harris was saying we shouldn't have any labels whatsoever because whatever label they come up with will be attacked. So there's no point having any labels at all. Other people, because they were quite into computers, wanted to call it GNU atheism, like GNU atheism, because there's a whole thing around the free software movement. There's a thing called the GPL, I think it's called the GNU public license, where the free software people will release things under this license. Wikipedia runs under this license. You scroll down to the bottom of any Wikipedia page, you'll see it's under the GPL, right? So it comes from this. They wanted to call it GNU atheism. But the side that won basically took the view that they wanted to create a kind of political movement around atheism. And if you're going to do that, it's important. Labels are important, right? And they were openly copying the gay rights movement and the feminist movement and the civil rights movement, quite openly in the conversations, like we need to copy what they did, right? And what they did, certainly in terms of the gay rights movement, is reclaim the word gay, which was initially a derogatory slur, but then became adopted as a badge of honour, right? And they said new atheism is being used to attack us, therefore we'll take the term new atheism and we'll own it. And that was where this particular idea became picked up on. So this is kind of the critics of new atheism saying there's nothing new about new atheism at all. I think there is. So this is my sort of proposition as to exactly what is new about new atheism. The first thing is the political aspect to it. So previous forms of atheism up to the 21st century had tended to challenge religion in the public sphere. This is essentially promoting the ideas of secularism. In addition to that, new atheists want to attack religion in the private sphere. They want to go after religion in the cultural level. They want to go into people's homes and divest them of their religious beliefs, sort of deprogram them, if you like. They want to change the ideology that people have. They're not content with just saying secularism is here, religious people can go off and do whatever they want, right? They want to kind of chase them and take their religious beliefs away. So it puts a much greater emphasis on religion in the cultural sphere, and this helps to explain, this political dimension helps to explain why new atheism is more popular in the United States than anywhere else. Because, well, let me just show you this. Oh, you're getting ahead of my slides again. There we go, religion in the private sphere. The status of atheists in the United States is pretty bad, right? I mean, it has been getting better in recent years, but this is sort of going back, you know, but actually not even that far, maybe a decade or so. If I direct your attention to the top line, groups that do not all agree with my vision of American society, atheists come top, right? And then if you scroll down to the next one, I would disapprove if my child wanted to marry a member of this group. Atheists, again, win. Nobody cares if you're an atheist in Sweden, right, or Finland, or Norway, or the UK, or whatever. But in the United States, they care quite a lot. So there was this idea in the United States that atheism was a civil rights issue, that they were sort of suffering lots of discrimination and, people kind of regarding them as having a very, very low status. There was one particular poll like this which showed atheists being lower than rapists, for example. That was sort of how bad atheism was regarded in the United States. So they're consistently voted as one of atheists' most distrusted minorities. So obviously you can then kind of see maybe the logic of the new atheist view saying, okay, it's not enough then to have secularism. We have to actually go after religion and take it on in the private sphere. The second main reason why I think there's something genuinely new about this is that it takes, philosophically, it's an interesting mix of different components, I think. So on the one hand, new atheism wants to reclaim this enlightenment idea of universal knowledge, that science can prove everything, right? There is an ultimate theory of everything, maybe, and science can kind of get there, right? Rationality in science can be used to build a model of reality. And this is the Enlightenment project, right? We would ultimately know how everything fitted together. But on the other hand, it's very strongly shaped by the ideas of postmodernism. And postmodernism was increasingly prominent during the post-war era as a reaction to the Enlightenment project, right? This idea of having universalizing, totalizing knowledge claims was one of the things that generated Nazism and communism, right? These all-encompassing ideologies that attempted or thought they could explain absolutely everything. And it led to the gas chambers and the gulags, right? And so there was a very strong reaction to this from the postmodernist side, which then emphasized, completely rejected this idea of meta-narratives, right? Meta-narratives would be an all-encompassing explanation of everything, right? And that was now to be rejected, and instead postmodernism started to emphasize the limits of human knowledge and started to emphasize intellectual pluralism and the value of diversity. It sometimes gets mocked for everybody can have their own particular truth, right? And truth is completely, relativistic. And I think maybe there is something to that, to be honest, with the postmodernist perspective. But from this point, it's simply the rejection of the idea that we can know everything. Now, so how do these two things fit together in the new atheist worldview? Well, it works a bit like this. One of the main products of postmodernism has been the rise of identity politics, right? People having different identities, different cultural identities, different social identities, things based around gender, for example, and race and sexuality. This is a product of the postmodern philosophical approach. This idea is then taken up by new atheists because of the marginalized position of atheists in the United States. They start to use the language of minority rights and start to capitalize on this idea of identity politics to promote their political ideas. So as I said previously, right, atheism gets taken up as a civil rights issue, which is essentially using identity politics and a sort of postmodernist slant. And all of this then underpins the political strategy adopted by new atheists, which was, the idea was that you could turn atheism more widely into a social movement, as I was sort of saying a few minutes ago. And so the only way they were ever going to get to change people's attitudes and to gain what they would say as civil rights in the United States was to construct a social movement and have political, and to force political change that way. Now, one of the main features of atheism here, as I said previously, is its online character. New atheism was a product of the internet, and it emerged on the internet. And politically, this means that it's largely disorganized, right? There's no single new atheist group that you can sign up to. You can't apply to an organization and get a membership card which says, I am, officially a new atheist, right? There's no central coordinating body behind it. It's very decentralized and very, very fragmented. New atheists will belong to a whole range of institutions, like, the Humanists or the Freedom from Religious Foundation or American Atheists. They're very scattered between the various different groups. So all of this stuff takes place from the New Atheist perspective online, and a key part of their political strategy was to create a sense of atheist identity. And the aim here was, you can see, right, one is, we need to get a symbol. What symbol are we going to have? And this one became kind of picked up as the, there was never a sort of vote on it. It was just one of those things that people just started to use. The letter A, the red letter A, to symbolize atheism, right? Now you've got an atheist identity. You can get a letter A badge or a T-shirt or whatever and identify yourself as being an atheist. Another part of their strategy was to normalize atheist beliefs. And the thinking here was, and this was the same, again, this was copied directly from the gay rights movement. There was a big thing in the gay rights movement called the Out campaign, where celebrities and famous people were outed as being gay. And the idea was that once people realized that there were like gay people everywhere, and that gay people were just neighbors and friends and colleagues and like perfectly normal people, then the general population would go, oh, okay, well, I guess gay people are fine then, have these civil liberties. And there was a similar thing here. The idea was that if atheists could demonstrate how many of them there were, then American society would change their attitude towards atheists. And so there were two main dimensions to this. One, as you can see at the top, was to have mass rallies. There was one mass rally in 2000, and when did I write this down? I can't remember, 2011 I think it was, called the Reason Rally in Washington. There was a follow-up in 2016 which didn't really do very well, so I don't think they've held any since, but that was one. The main way of doing this was to advertise. So the atheists would hire billboards and they would put up atheist adverts, and this is a famous one. This was the London bus campaign, which was then copied in various parts of the world, saying there's probably no God, now just, stop worrying and get on with the rest of your life. So this is the political side of New Atheism, right? To try to normalize atheism in the United States, to change people's attitudes towards atheism, and to do it in these various different ways. Now, the success of New Atheism is very difficult to figure out. On the one hand, because it's very hard to draw causality between these things, right? You can't prove that if something happens in 2015, it's because of the emergence of the New Atheist movement in 2000, 2006. So it's very difficult to measure the effects of this. But one thing that we noted last week has been the increasing numbers of people in the United States describing themselves as having no religion. And I think it would be weird if New Atheism did not have a role in that. I don't think it was the only factor, but I think it was certainly a factor. But, you can see here, I'm showing you these two charts. One of the things that's happened is that in recent years, interest in New Atheism and atheism generally, these are figures taken from the United States, from Google Trends, by the way, although you do get very similar trends globally. Interest in it's just sort of dropped off a cliff. As you can sort of see here, it peaks around about, 2012? Maybe, looking at the bottom one, the top one is probably quite similar, and then it declines, and it doesn't recover from this. So, what has happened? What happened to New Atheism? This to me is really weird, right? This sort of demands an explanation. And I was doing some research into this a couple of years ago, and then I ended up writing a paper on it. And this was essentially my starting point. This was the puzzle. Why does that happen? New Atheism, really popular, international bestsellers, all over the media, all over the news, YouTube debates, everything else, and all of a sudden it's gone. It's like an extinction level event, like an asteroid coming out and then just kills it all off. So what happened? Well, there's two different explanations for this. One explanation from the New Atheist side is that they achieved their objectives. This was what they would say, right? They set out to normalize atheism, to get the message out there, and they've succeeded, and there's simply no point carrying on banging on the same message, writing the same book 4 or 5 or 6 times, right? So they have succeeded, and that's why they no longer promote these ideas. The second explanation is that New Atheism died, and it became completely ineffective. Christopher Hitchens died, for example. Daniel Dennett died more recently. others like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins drifted off into the alt-right, anti-woke, Jordan Peterson-style sort of manosphere thing, and then they became divorced from reality, and now that's what they do. And so they sort of lost their credibility, and the movement became increasingly fragmented. So there's two different takes on this to explain this data. Another reason behind this, though, this is sort of my particular approach, is that once you start to create a social movement, you inevitably become drawn into a particular pattern of politics. And once that happens, you're then exposed to all kinds of internal divisions. And so essentially what happened in this case was that they tried to turn atheism into a social movement. And atheism is what in discourse theory, which if you do discourse theory you might run into this idea, is called an empty signifier, right? Which is essentially a phrase or a term that can mean anything to anybody. Brexit is a fabulous example of this, right? Vote for Brexit. What does Brexit mean? Anything you like. You can be a complete free marketeer and call it Brexit. You can be a complete, let's leave the EU and the UK should leave the world and have its own planet, and that's also Brexit, right? So the genius of the Leave campaign was that the idea of Brexit could mean anything to anybody. It was why they won. It was an empty signifier. And atheism was the same. Atheism was an empty signifier. You could be a right-wing atheist, a left-wing atheist, a centrist, didn't matter, whatever, just call yourself an atheist and you can basically believe whatever you like. And this worked really well for getting the movement going. But once you reach a certain point, once you reach a certain size, then it becomes, we've had all the debates about labels and everything else, right? So you can see there were certain fractures going on even during the early part of the movement. But once you get to a particular point, you then have to decide, what are the aims of the movement going to be? What exactly is this movement for? What exactly are the political strategies going to be? Where do we go from here? We've got this movement, now what do we do with it? And there comes a point in every empty signifier's life where you have to decide what it is you're going to be. And when that point arrived for the atheist movement was when it fell apart. And the problem wasn't just that atheism is an empty signifier and you can get all kinds of irreconcilable views together. The problem was also that this was happening at exactly the same time when the culture wars in the United States were getting booster rockets put underneath it by the whole Trumpian campaign starting to get going for the presidency, right? So politics in the United States became incredibly polarized and everything became politicized, and so people's political affiliations, their tribal political identities began to supersede everything else, and this blew the atheist movement apart. And let me just give you two very quick examples of this. These are two of the key flashpoints. One, which I think called Elevator Gate, which was when a blogger called Rebecca Watson was at a conference in Ireland in 2012, and she was propositioned in a lift going back to her room after a talk. This was like about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And then she made a blog about it afterwards saying this was really bad, like men, don't do this, it's not cool, and so on. And there was a huge backlash against her, like a really misogynistic backlash, including, by the way, from Richard Dawkins, who came out and said, Rebecca Watson needs to grow up or grow a thicker skin, right? There was an immense backlash to this. And so in response to that, there was another movement, an attempt to set up a movement which didn't really go very far, called Atheism Plus, which was the idea behind this was that atheism requires progressive political views. Right? You can't have atheism without progressive political views because the two things don't, religion is a barrier to liberation for LGBT people. It's a barrier for racial equality. It's a barrier for, gender equality. Therefore, the two things have a natural affinity, right? So atheism plus all these other social progressive ideas. Now, this was also completely attacked by the movement. Basically, at this point became divided between the progressives and the right-wing conservatives, who argued that all of this, and I'm not making this up, all of this was an attempt by radical feminists to take over the movement and to stretch the definition of atheism too far. And what they said was that atheism is not political. Atheism is just, I do not believe in gods. That's it. Sometimes called dictionary atheism, right? That's it. You cannot get a political viewpoint from that. So trying to turn it into a political movement is trying to claim the movement for themselves and drag it off in this completely different direction. And I'm going to leave you with a couple of quotes because we are out of time. By this point, this is sort of by 2015, this is the situation. Greta Christina, who was one of the Atheism Plus promoters, said, at this point we've got two atheist movements. We've got those who want to have social justice and those who don't care about it. And then on the other side, we have the right-wing conservative side essentially saying that all of this Atheism Plus stuff is now woke. This is the woke mind virus has taken over, this mind virus, they do like their mind viruses, it has taken over the movement, it has killed the atheist movement. In fact, this is so unusual because now what's happened, the people on the conservative right-wing side of atheism who started out hating the Christian right because they were religious and crazy and backwards and everything else, now they're saying we have to form an alliance with the Christian right because they're the only people who can help us stop the woke, and the woke are going to lead to the downfall of America and by extension human civilization. This is where we're at now, folks. New atheism has fallen apart, and that's it from me. So thanks again for coming, and I will see you all next time.